Okay, I think we'll start, and people will join us as we move along, as we want to keep to our schedule. So welcome to tonight's session. This is the fourth and final installment of our summer series. I hope you've been enjoying them and attending what you have been able to, obviously, in terms of summer and your schedules. In terms of what is upcoming, we'll talk more about it a little bit later on, but we have a final session on Saturday, September 11th from 10 till noon. So tonight's agenda, we have our welcome, opening prayer, land acknowledgement, and then we have Roberto Chiotti, who is going to talk about with us about redevelopment and sustainable design. We have a Q&A session, so just a reminder to people that as you have questions, as we move along through the presentation, to please type your questions in the chat box, and then at 7:35 we'll have an opportunity to pose those questions to Roberto, and then we'll talk a little bit about the next session. So if you're on someone else's computer, you have an opportunity, if you like, to rename yourself if it's the name is not you. And to do that, you see the three dots, you click on that and then rename, and then you just type in the name that you want to identify you with tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Elaine Golden right now for our opening prayer and land acknowledgement. Elaine.
Thanks, Rob. Let us pray. Loving and life-giving God, we thank you for gathering us online tonight. You have placed us in relationship with yourself, with all our fellow human beings, and with the vast web of your creation. Too often we have engaged with our work, even the work that we have done in your name, in ways that have dishonored and defaced your creatures. Give us hearts and minds to seek your ways in all we do, so that in our embrace of your purpose, we would sustain and renew the life of the earth. Through the one in whom all creation is redeemed, your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. The Diocese of Toronto is located on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Ottawa, and the Anishinaabe nations. This land was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe and allied nations to share and care peaceably for the land around the Great Lakes. We acknowledge in particular those First Nations communities located within the borders of the diocese, the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are signatories of the Toronto Treaties, the Chippewas of Georgina, the Chippewas of Rama, the Mississaugas of Scugog, Alderville, Hiawatha, and Curve Lake First Nations. We commit ourselves to confronting, challenging, and uprooting racism and colonialism at all levels of our personal, social, and corporate life, so that we might all uphold the spirit of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant for our mutual flourishing. Tonight, I'd like to introduce, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Roberto Chiotti. Roberto is the founding principal of Larkin Architects Limited. In addition to his professional architectural training, Roberto has a Master of Theological Studies from the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, with a specialty in theology and ecology granted by the Elliott Allen Institute for Theology and Ecology. In 2003, he has achieved accreditation in LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Roberto is also a member of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals and was recently invested as a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. Roberto has been invited to write and speak extensively on the topics of sustainable design, sacred space, and the cosmological response to the ecological crisis at educational institutions, religious and architecture conferences, and professional organizations in Canada and the US. In addition, Roberto currently serves as a member of the Bishop's Committee for Creation Care in the Diocese of Toronto, and it's in that capacity that I've got to know him a bit better recently. So welcome, Roberto, and we really look forward to what you have to share with us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to this fourth session on redevelopment for parishes and affordable housing. And I'm going to be speaking on the topic of sustainable design, but I want to make it clear that sustainable design is not an accessory consideration, that it really has to be thought of in the same conversation with everything else that you've learned so far and more. Next slide. So in terms of what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to start with just a brief introduction, in addition to what Aileen said, about my background and point of departure for tonight's conversation. Next, we're going to establish what I believe to be the current context for the presentation. And then we're going to look at some big picture considerations for any redevelopment project. You guys so far have been looking at some very, very specific solutions and kind of digging into the weeds. And I want to kind of zoom out again and really kind of establish the kind of big picture critical thinking that has to be brought to any redevelopment project. Next. And then finally, I will share some sustainable design strategies, examples, and resources. What you're probably all hoping to receive tonight is a nice, neat checklist that you could tick off all the boxes and say, if I've done all these things, then I can feel good about my project being sustainable. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. So most of the evening will be spent describing the complexities of introducing the idea or seeing a redevelopment project through the lens of sustainability. Next. So in terms of my background, as Aileen said, I've been principal of Larkin Architect Limited for, I'm founding principal and was principal for 25 years. I've now passed on the leadership of the firm, or rather the ownership of the firm, to the next generation, but remain in the capacity of advisor and mentor and employee of the corporation. And we are dedicated to the design of sustainable sacred space. Possibly about 90% of our work is dedicated to sacred space. And I'll be sharing approaches and strategies to sustainable redevelopment of church properties, not all of which relate to affordable housing, but I think that everything we're going to talk about is definitely applicable. And these all evolve from my grounding in eco-theology, from my theological degree, and my experience as both a heritage architect and one that advocates for transformative design. So in addition to my practice, I've been teaching and participating as a volunteer on a number of committees who are really focused on trying to transform the profession and make sure that spirituality and sustainability forms a basis for all built form. So this is, I'm going to read this twice because I think this is a really important point. My argument, whenever I do these presentations, I always start with my critique that the current level of discourse with respect to sustainability, with some notable exceptions, remains focused on making small incremental improvements to dysfunctional modes of production and consumption that enable us to indefinitely defer the transformational change necessary to bring about a viable human presence and a planetary future worth inheriting for all creation. So it's, you know, we all want to feel good about the improvements we're making to our lives, whether it's recycling or driving a hybrid car or whatever. But, and I don't want to dismiss those initiatives, but I really think we're at the point in which we need transformational change in order to ensure that viable future moving forward. Next. Thank you, Livia. So we all know recently that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a very dire report in the last few days, providing a very sobering projection of the effects of climate change, which is a real and imminent threat to life on Earth as we know it. And next. So needless to say, time is of the essence. Next. So the bad news is that buildings contribute as much as 55% of all greenhouse gas emissions within urban centers like the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and 40% globally, like spread over the entire globe. So the others, of course, are transportation, the oil industry, those kinds of things, but buildings are obviously a very significant contributor. Next. So the not bad news, and I don't want to characterize this as good news, and I'll explain why. The building industry actually has the technology and expertise to create net zero emission buildings today. We have what it takes to do that. We don't have the will as yet, but we certainly have the technology. However, I want to emphasize that most of the conversation remains focused on technology as a way to solving the ecological crisis. And I really think it's a much bigger issue than that, and that just looking to technologies to solve our problems is not going to do it. That really, it requires a shift in cosmology, in worldview, one that will suggest to us that we have to relinquish our our human exceptionalism rather, as an a priori value, and really look at the Earth's needs as primary and the human's needs as derivative. Until we're willing to do that, I don't think we'll be able to solve the ecological crisis. Next. And the latest news is within my profession is that beyond looking at emissions of buildings once they're built, we're also very much concerned about a building's embodied carbon. And we're finding that that is becoming an increasingly important issue to resolve. It's in the early stages of understanding embodied carbon in our buildings, but certainly that is an important issue. Let me give you an example. Studies are showing that in order to accommodate the increase of population on the planet between now and 2040, most of which will be migrating towards urban environments, we have to build a city the size of Manhattan every month between now and 2040. And even if every single one of those buildings was built to be operationally zero carbon emissions, like no greenhouse gas emissions, just the construction of those buildings will put us over the 1.5 degree increase in temperature that we've committed to not doing, right? To not exceeding. Next. So good news, this is, I would characterize this as good news. Municipalities like the City of Toronto have developed and just adopted strategies and policies to have all buildings, both new and existing, throughout the entire city to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, beginning with between 2020 and 2024 voluntary measures, moving towards mandatory measures. So what that means that even your house and my house, if you live in a single family dwelling, will be required between now and 2050 to change out our gas-fired furnaces for heat pumps or other electric-based zero-emission technologies. Same with our domestic hot water heaters, our stoves, anything fuel-fired appliance. Next. And I strongly believe that the evolving carbon tax will eventually make the cost of heating with fossil fuels prohibitive. We just completed a net zero emission building, new church for the Hamilton Diocese, Roman Catholic Diocese in Hamilton Diocese in Milton. And we did the math because the whole place is heated with and cooled with geothermal. and made the case with just a modest carbon tax that the parish would save $1.5 million over the next 50 years in operational maintenance costs by investing in a geothermal system now. Next. So I'm going to put on my heritage hat for a minute, because this is a huge conversation within our community. The most sustainable buildings are the ones that already exist. Now that may be counterintuitive, particularly if you're spending $5,000 a month to heat your church right now in the wintertime. But when you consider the idea of embodied carbon, the existing buildings already have used up a lot of carbon in the extraction of their materials, in the processing of them into materials and systems, the transportation and erection. So next. So even the most sustainable new building will take decades to offset its embodied carbon when compared to renovating or repurposing an existing building that it replaces. That's maybe a little difficult to get your head around, but it is evidence is demonstrating that to be the case. Next. So if you are considering redevelopment, then I would say that there is an existential, theological, or spiritual, moral, ethical, and practical imperative to do it right. There's no point in going half measures, because all the decisions that you make now will have profound impacts for the future. And if you don't go deep with your sustainability strategies, and then you will end up being forced to upgrade them in future before their life expectancy has been achieved. So it's better to do more now. So what does this mean, and how do we proceed? Is the obvious question. Next. I want to just take a moment, because of my background, to talk about some contributing voices which have influenced the way I approach sustainability. So one voice, for those who are familiar with Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home, it's an encyclical that Pope Francis promulgated back in 2015. And he references the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, that really these are one and the same. And so what from it, just in a one sentence summary, I would say that what is needed, or what he's calling us to, is an ecological conversion, or to use the Greek word metanoia, which is a transformative change of heart, usually spiritually informed and prompted. But we really need to embrace the fact that any conversation around economics, social justice, and ecology are really part of the same indivisible conversation. So, whatever you learned about how to address indigenous issues or indigenous peoples in your redevelopment proposals, or racial equality, sustainability, the economic goals, sustainable economic goals that you may have for your project, all of these really have to be seen within the same conversation and not independent of each other. Next. Another voice is Dieter Hessel, who's a theologian, and he says that eco-justice occurs wherever human beings receive enough sustenance and build enough community to love harmoniously with God, to achieve equity among humans, and to appreciate the rest of creation for its own sake. In other words, to understand every element of creation for its intrinsic value, and not simply as it's for its instrumental value to be used, consumed, exploited for the benefit of humankind. So I appreciate that I'm probably already preaching to the choir here tonight, but I don't think it's harmful to kind of reframe the conversation in these big picture kind of contributions. Next. And then my own mentor, Thomas Berry, in his Dream of the Earth, speaks about the fact that we are in the terminal phase of the Cenozoic age of geological history. So when the Cenozoic age began about 125 million years ago, with the birth of angiosperms, of flowers. And it was only after the dinosaurs became extinct, flowers and the mammals were able to flourish and ultimately create the conditions for humans to emerge on the planet. And we're at the terminal phase of the Cenozoic age, insofar as our pervasive human presence on the planet has begun to shut down the biodiversity and the integral functioning of all the systems of the planet that were flourishing when we emerged as a species. So he thinks we're on the threshold of two options. One would be to move towards the technological age, and I'm afraid that we're already deeply embedded in that. Or alternatively, to move towards the ecological age, which will represent a time that is establishes a more mutually enhancing human-earth relationship instead of our current exploitive relationship. So he believes that it's only the bringing about of the ecological age that will foster the deep awareness of the sacred presence within each reality of the universe, whether it's an atom, a star, a solar system, another human being, a mammal, mountain, stream. Only such a comprehensive vision can produce the commitment required to stop the world of exploitation, of manipulation, of violence so intense that it threatens to destroy not only the human city, but also the planet itself. Okay, next. So first things first. Before you start talking about the goals of the project, you know, the fact that you want to maybe have affordable housing, a soup kitchen, that you want to have this particular revenue stream, you want a new church out of the deal, it's absolutely essential that you cultivate it and be animated by a sense of collective purpose that recognizes we all belong to something greater than ourselves, an overarching intentionality, internally driven, that will serve to navigate the process and its stressors. There has to be a why. This is from a recent podcast that I heard on CBC from Anthony Burrows. And it's also the basis, very important, that we use in all of our working with all the parishes. Essentially, I can't tell you, years ago when we first started talking to parishes who wanted to redevelop the properties, they were all gung-ho, and then for sure, all these wonderful goals became obstacles, and at the end of the day, they couldn't find a developer who was willing to partner with them to achieve their goals. And in the end, many parishes sold their property outright to a developer, took the money and ran. And as a result, the heritage church or the community asset was torn down to build market condominiums, which I think would be the last thing on everybody's mind to do. Next. So again, Thomas Berry, another way to put it is that the dream drives the action. So one of the things we do with every parish before they, you know, when we're first commissioned, before they even begin a project, was we undertake a fulsome parish visioning process for the project and begin to ask the big questions. So what are the aspirations of the project? What are the values that will inform the decision-making process? This is really important because these processes usually take a long time, and it is very easy to lose sight of the big picture and the end goal. And you can go off track so easily and at the end realize that you haven't achieved the intentionality of the project. So some of the questions we also ask parishes, regardless of whether they're thinking about a new church or redeveloping for housing, whatever, is what is essential to our well-being as a parish community? Because you're the drivers of the project. And in addition to the community, to that of the planet as a global community of living and non-living entities. So some of the other questions that you need to think about is, how do we want the world to see us as we proceed with this project? What is it going to say about us to the world? How do we want to collaborate with each other? And how do we want to partner with the world around us? Next. So my suggestion is that we think like the planet in its 4.5 billion years of self-regulating, self-educating evolution, that what Thomas Berry would describe as cosmogenesis, the actual ability of the universe, and in particular the Earth as we know it, to develop and evolve from, for example, the helium and hydrogen that was produced at the great flaring forth at the beginning of time, to the extensive diversity of life that we see on the planet today. Next. So the three fundamental laws of cosmogenesis are as follows. And the first is what I just described, that during that evolutionary process, the universe and the planet has always moved towards greater differentiation or diversity. The second is that the universe is not so much a collection of objects, but rather a communion of subjects, insofar as each single element of the universe, again, whether it's a piece of bacteria, an atom, a solar system, a human, or anything else on the planet, is a unique expression of that 14 billion years of evolutioning. So each one of us is shares that heritage. So right now, the big thing in the news is all these billionaires going out into space. You know, we start talking about going to Mars or interstellar travel, and you know, science fiction talks about aliens. My contention is that there is no such thing as an alien, because we're all related to each other. So whoever we find, wherever we go, we're actually exploring our hood, our own hood, and that we're really, hopefully, our intention is to seek out our neighbors to find out more about how to live rightly on the earth. Anyway, and the fourth, of course, is, or the third rather, is communion or interrelationship, how everything in the universe is interconnected and interdependent in an unbroken bond. Next. So the questions that emerge out of those laws of the universe, and if we want to be in alignment with those laws of the universe, we have to ask ourselves, what impact will our project decisions have on diversity and differentiation? More specifically, do my material specifications diminish diversity by negatively impacting wilderness habitat from where they're being extracted, human displacement, exploitation, and or non-renewable resources? We tend not to think about those issues, right? That's a bit like when we when we're proud of buying an inexpensive t-shirt, we don't think about where it's made, who's been exploited, what pollution has been created. Like all these things in economic equations are considered externalities, meaning they don't affect the bottom line in traditional economic equations, when in fact, they absolutely do. And the earth is reminding us that they do. And the awareness of social justice is making us aware of that. So can our project even promote biophilia or a love of the natural world by restoring habitat or being regenerative by creating more resources than the project consumes? Back in 2015, when I was teaching at OCAD University and serving as the sustainability officer for the Faculty of Design, I co-chaired an international conference entitled Urban Ecologies, which really tried to look at ways of understanding cities as ecosystems. So instead of looking at the sort of distribution of goods and services and transportation, to really look at that as really those things as nutrients and wastes, and then look to ecosystems to see how they how they deal with those issues. So for example, this became absolutely crystal clear to me when I had the great privilege of being able to live out a childhood dream of my wife, which was to go to South Africa and on safari and see big cats and other animals in their natural habitat. I think the most profound thing that I discovered when I was there was that there's absolutely no waste in that ecosystem, that every single animal, whether it's the top of the head of the heap predator like the lions, or the mitochondria that create the conditions for the termites to exist, which create the mounds that the cheetahs sit on to view the prey and their predators, there's no waste. Every animal in the system contributes to the overall health of that ecosystem. So next. How do our project decisions affect the subjective identity and authenticity at the heart of every being as unique expressions of the divine? Do our choices recognize and give expression to the intrinsic value and not just the instrumental value of a material? So let me give you an example. I'm sure many of you have heard or familiar with David Suzuki, and I have, and maybe you've even heard him speak. If you have, you may remember a story he often tells about the time when he was trying to protest against the logging of old growth forests. And he was in a meeting with a CEO of a major lumber company, which will remain unnamed, to protect the innocent. But at one point in the conversation, as they were arguing back and forth, the CEO pointed his finger at David Suzuki and said, "You do not understand. The problem is you don't understand that those trees have no value until I cut them down." So, you know, David went, whoa, we have a failure to communicate here. Obviously, there are two opposing worldviews. One that sees all creation strictly as commodities to be exploited for human use. So the value is only in how they can become 2x4s or paper or toilet paper or whatever. Whereas David Suzuki sees the forest as an ecosystem, a habitat, a heat sink, you know, contributing to the transpiration, the oxygen of the planet, you know, the sort of complexities that contribute to the overall health of all of us. Next. How do our project decisions affect the interconnectedness or communion of all living and non-living entities? Do our choices recognize the interdependencies within the web of life that exist in an unbroken bond? Or do our choices negatively impact the integrity of ecosystems within which the materials are either extracted, processed, transported, and erected? So even something that we've all embraced, solar power, you know, or electric cars, the lithium that is the base metal lithium, which is used in all of its technology, is quite invasive. And so, you know, you really have to consider the big picture of all these decisions. Next. If possible, here's again, putting on my heritage hat. Can the existing church or any portion of the property or part of the church thereof remain and be renovated and adapted for worship and other uses with shared values? So for example, one of the partners that we have the privilege of working with is somebody by name of Graham Singh, who runs a foundation called Trinity Centers. And for some, he might be controversial, but what he does is he helps parishes find other partners with similar values to see if together they can share in the upkeep costs and revenue streams for an existing building to provide financial sustainability for the parish moving forward. Next. We're finally going to get into some images, and I'm going to, you know, we're all sort of visually oriented. So Here's an example. This is a church at the corner of Jarvis and College. It currently belongs to Grace Church of Toronto. It was originally built when the St. Andrew's Presbyterian congregation that was at Adelaide had a falling out, and half went to the St. Andrew's Church that we're all familiar with next to Massey Hall. Not Massey Hall, Roy Thompson Hall in King Street. And the other half moved here. Eventually in the 1950s, that group moved up to Bloor Street, and the church was taken over, purchased by the Latvian Lutheran Church. And then eventually they sold the church to Grace Church, who were a new evangelical Christian denomination that was really growing. They had been worshiping at a school, in a school auditorium. And they wanted to be, their mandate was to carry out the Christian ministry within the downtown core to the marginalized and poor. So they were looking for a home. They found this church, but they needed significantly more space. And yet, for those who know this corner, it's bounded by College, Jarvis, and then Allen Gardens on the other two sides. So there was really no room to expand. And being a heritage building, they couldn't really negatively impact the character-defining elements of the exterior building envelope. So instead, what we did was we went down. So next slide. So this was the photograph on the left and the top are the existing basement, very low ceiling, not used for much other than storage. And so the bottom picture is of the construction, the start of construction to underpin and excavate the basement to create the additional space that the parish needed. Next slide. So this is what we created. We created a series of all their administrative offices, new washrooms in the basement, sort of a little gathering space to kind of process all their children education that occurs on Sundays. Next slide. So these are a series of offices around the perimeter where we could have access to daylight, and on the inside, in the internal portion of the basement, we created a lot of storage and the washrooms and that sort of thing. So during the week, this office is used for parish administration and different lay ministries, but during the weekend, it gets transformed into a children's classroom. Next. This was the original way to get to the washrooms in the basement. Many parents were afraid to send their kids to the basement on their own. And the next slide is how we reorganize the existing space to enable this light-filled, gracious stair that takes you now, and sort of communication stair that connects upstairs and downstairs. Next. This was the main entrance of the church from College. And as you can see, it's quite a constricted area, just enough room for a little table. And then the door, the image on the right is the doors from that space into the social space of the church. And next slide. So just by reorganizing the flow, we created a brand new narthex and gathering space and orienting space, which connects to the worship space behind this picture, behind you, as you're from your view, to the stair that takes you down into the basement spaces, and then to the newly renovated social hall to the right, Colleges to the left. Next. So this was the state of the social space prior to our renovation. And then the next slide is the space now, which is become much larger, even though we haven't expanded beyond the existing walls of the building. And there are, in this photograph, this was their, when they consecrated the church, they invited all the neighbors to come in, and they had photographs of a photographic display of neighbors who were doing great things in the neighborhood. So whether they were merchants, or they were NGOs, or other community groups, this was their way of welcoming the broader community into their new facility, and to engage with them and partner with them. Next. This was the upper social hall, serving the balcony area. And the next slide, please, is how we transformed it. Again, kind of dismantling anything that had been added over the years to create these big open spaces that provided a lot of flexibility and opportunity for future growth and diversity of activities. Next. This is the original sanctuary. And next is what we did, which was fairly small interventions. We introduced air conditioning. We repainted all the surfaces. We improved the lighting and the sound systems. We increased the stage area so that it was more flexible for concerts and other theatrical events. We replaced the pews with more contemporary curved pews so that they were now also accessible. And you can make an easy transition from a wheelchair onto a pew, for example, or from a walker onto a pew. Next. And then again, obviously, this is part of the raison d'etre for these presentations. But if there is surplus land available, is it possible to develop affordable housing or some other community use that is needed in the community? And I will use an example that's in the planning stages. Next. So this is an existing property in Kitchener. It consists of Sacred Heart Church in the bottom left-hand corner. It also includes an abandoned convent, which is the building in the middle, 79 Moore Avenue, and a redundant Catholic school, elementary school. It is all part, all these buildings are listed in the heritage directory in the city of Kitchener. And in fact, together, they are seen by the city as a heritage cultural landscape. And originally the diocese purchased the convent and the school, and with the intent of demolishing them in order to increase the parking for the church. Because as you know, most suburban churches require a lot of parking. But the city would not grant the demolition permit, and instead they were convinced to kind of look at working with the local Polish community to repurpose those buildings for affordable seniors housing. Next slide. So the reason why it's such a great site is it provides a lot of amenities within walking distance, which are all important when you're looking for funding for affordable housing. These are part of the granting criteria. Next. So this is just a bit of a diagram to show the way we developed a solution. So part of it was to maintain the convent in its entirety, to be converted into units. And then the front half of the school, like the first structural bay, was going to be retained for its heritage value, and to create a 3-story atrium that would be a wayfinding and orienting device and kind of accommodate all the amenities. Next. So there's just a view. So we're building new affordable housing kind of behind the facade of that existing building, and trying to do it in incorporate sustainable design features. Next. So you probably already know this, but the National Housing Strategy now includes $70 billion worth of funding available for affordable housing, accessible housing, energy efficient buildings, buildings that are located, or affordable housing that's located where local amenities are within walking distance, and housing that helps priority groups, whether it's Indigenous, seniors, supportive housing for those who need assistance. So all of these, if you can achieve all of these goals, then you get more money available to you, both in terms of loans and outright grants. Next. So obviously, to be sustainable, you should only build what you absolutely need. How many of the spaces can be flexible? How many, most church buildings are most active on the weekends, and some are barely used during the week. How can you ensure through partnerships and other ministries that the building is fully occupied, as much of the time as possible? What interventions will be the most sensitive to featuring and preserving the character-defining heritage elements of an existing historic church property? That's really important. Next. So for example, this is the basement of the church in Guelph on Catholic Hill, which is built in the 1850s. We were hired to renovate the church and restore it. It's a National Heritage Site defined or designated by Parks Canada as an exemplar of a Gothic revival church architecture in Canada, one of only 4 such churches. So we were, part of our mandate was to take, this is in the basement, is to patch and repair the existing plaster on the foundation walls. And when we put a moisture meter onto those walls, we discovered that the moisture content was such that any kind of patching and painting would just reappear in the very near future, and that would be a waste of money. And similarly, the floor structure was wood sitting on the earth, so it was rotting and creating all sorts of mold, and yet these spaces were used for children's liturgies. Next. So this is what we did instead. We used the funds available for the restoration of the basement to add plaster and paint to actually remove it. And this allowed the walls to dry out and expose the beauty of the original stone rubble walls that characterize. So in other words, it's a heritage defining or character defining element of this heritage building. Next, keep it simple. One of the strategies I would say is to orient the building to take advantage of passive solar energy. If your site allows, to make sure that it's oriented, that if you can't make a square building or almost square building, if it has to be oblong, then make sure that the south and north facing are the longer ones and the east and the west are the shorter ones, simply because it's much harder to control heat gain and heat loss through an east and west exposure. And it's much easier to manage that on the south. And of course, the north, you try to keep the number of openings to a minimum. Next. This is a new church. It was it's St. Gabriel's parish in North York, completed in 2006. It was designed to embody the eco-theology of Father Thomas Berry, a Passionist who was my mentor when I was studying. And it is a completely new typology that gives expression to the immanent presence of the divine, as opposed to just the transcendent presence of the divine. So here is a scene in winter. We have a south-facing window that harvests the sun's energy between the fall equinox and the spring equinox. It has a projecting canopy that is canted at 22 degrees, again, to kind of maximize that harvesting passively of the sun's energy. That sun's energy comes in, hits the concrete floor and the walls, gets absorbed. It serves as a heat sink, which then radiates that heat back into the space at night. Next. Here's an exterior view in the summer showing how the canopy shades that passively, so to reduce the cooling loads. Next. Around the remaining 3 walls, concrete walls, we designed a skylight and commissioned David Pearl, a glass artist, to create stained glass. So what happens is that the sun, as the Earth is rotating on its axis and changing its position relative to the sun, through that rotation, the sun comes through the skylights, either on the east, the west, or the north side, and basically dematerializes the concrete wall and provides all the decoration. So there's no paint, there's no drywall, it's raw concrete, but it's the sun that creates this dynamic play of light in the space and reminds us of cosmic time and invites the sun to participate in the liturgy. Next. Here's another view. So really, these are the Stations of the Cross taken from the original church on this property, as were the pews and some of the other elements, but now seen in the new context. So the Passion of Christ is now seen in the context of the Passion as embracing or including the Passion of the earth. Next. So another really, really important strategy is to ensure your building envelope is airtight and well insulated. Use also local materials with low embodied carbon and or carbon storage capacity. Next slide, please. This is this new church in Milton that I was describing earlier that is net zero energy. So part of it is because it's within sight of the escarpment, the Niagara Escarpment, we used local stone to ground the new church in its ecological context and its geological context. In fact, we laid up the stone much the way in which the stone naturally was laid up and created through the ages on the escarpment. We used a lot of wood, as you can see, albeit that wood does come from the West Coast, but it is essentially storing all that carbon within the church and can be easily dismantled and repurposed if ever the church was to be demolished. For those who understand our values, we designed this church that was way beyond code requirements. So the roof has an R60 resistance to heat loss. The walls have an effective R value of R35, and all the glazing has an effective R value of R8. It's triple glazed with a krypton gas between each in each void. Next. Dante, stop. This is another view from the altar looking back towards the narthex. And as you can see, even though the lights are on for the sake of this photograph, there's so much natural light that very little electricity is being used. And in fact, all the heating and cooling is geothermal. So there are no greenhouse gas emissions to operate the building. And we have a 95 kilowatt solar array that offsets all the electrical power that we're using to run those systems. Next. So that's just an image of the layers in the escarpment. Next. And this is just a view of the exterior of the building of the parish offices, parish office entrance, showing how we laid up the coursing of the stone from the escarpment to make reference to that natural way. You'll also see in the foreground there to the right, 3 electrical car charging stations, which was, and we have rough ends for a total of 12. Next. So the first strategy is to orient the building properly, to take advantage of passive solar energy and shading and cooling, and then to make as airtight and insulated a building envelope. And then the next strategy beyond that would be to use the most energy efficient mechanical systems where possible, zero carbon emissions such as geothermal, heat pumps, and energy recovery units, or displacement ventilation. Take advantage of natural ventilation. Where possible, consider how the building decisions can also serve as a form of catechesis, pausing us to reflect and invite transformation. The thing about one of the mandates of St. Gabriel's was to use it as a teaching device to help people come to an awareness and understanding of eco-theology and how it could be implemented in the design of a new worship space. Next. Oh, sorry. This is that National Historic Site in Guelph. And like I said, we were commissioned to restore it. So obviously there was no intention to demolish, but there was absolutely no room around the site to put any mechanical equipment. We certainly didn't want to put it on the roof of this building. The slide on the right is the renovation that we completed, which was to restore and reinforce its neo-Gothic features. And next slide, please. Our mandate, this is the parish hall in the basement. Our mandate was to air condition the space and to provide ventilation. And we did that using a series of geothermal wells in the parking lot. And then next slide, please. We kind of cleared a space in the basement, which had been used for storage, to accommodate all the equipment. So you don't see anything on the exterior of the building, any evidence of the air conditioning and ventilation for the building. And we created storage and other kind of found spaces within the interior of the building. Next. This is the north exit St. Gabriel's, and it incorporates natural materials like the stone on the right. And another feature at the very end is something called the living walls. Some of you may be familiar with those. They were developed by the University of Guelph many years ago, and they're a natural system that replicates mechanical equipment that would normally oxygenate and humidify the air of a building. So basically what it does is all the air is in that space is drawn through the living wall, and all the pollutants and particulates that we bring in from the street on our clothes and off-gassing of all our nylon and polyester clothing gets deposited on the roots of the plants, which are constantly bathed in recirculating water. And the bacteria and enzymes on the roots of the plant, the mitochondria, break down those pollutants into food for the plants. It humidifies the air, provides oxygen for the air, and that gets recirculated into the space. So I can say that when I go into that space in the winter, it's like walking into a tropical jungle. But theologically, what it also does is remind us the sound of that water, where it's located, is at the entrance from the underground parking. So theologically, it takes us from the darkness of the underworld into the lightness of the liturgical space above. And as we travel through that stair, it reminds us of our baptismal covenant, of the fact that water is used as the purity of water is important in our Christian initiation rites. And if we pollute that water, then baptism will no longer represent new life in Christ, but death. So next. Again, this is a view coming up the stairs to that with the living wall on the landing. And on the right is the baptismal font, which is again taken from the old church that used to occupy the site and repurposed and transformed to represent living water. And it's located here at the end of the antiphonal sacred access in front of the garden to remind us that when we're initiated into the Christian community, we're also welcomed into the earth community. Next. So where possible, use renewables to offset any remaining energy use, or alternatively invest in renewable energy providers and developers such as Bullfrog Power. So when we got our site plan approval for St. Gabriel's, the local councillor insisted that we not be allowed to put any solar panels or turbines on the roof. And again, he was just being obstreperous. And so instead, we invested in Bullfrog Power, and from day one, we have contributed a significant amount of money towards the greening of the existing grid, which is somehow considered as purchasing carbon offsets. But at the same time, I think it's just as important to improve and accelerate the transformation of our electrical grid as it is for individual projects. Next. So here is a rendering of the new church in Milton with the solar arrays mounted on carports in the parking lot. So not only are they generating, they're in the best position to generate electrical energy, but they're also providing shade in summertime for some of the cars and protection from the snow in wintertime. Next. So I want to just leave you at the end of my conversation with presentation rather with some potential resources. For the big picture, there's fortunately now there's so many options available compared to when I first studied theology many years ago. But I would say here are 3 books that I think are very salient to the conversation tonight. One is Thomas Berry's The Christian Future and the Fate of the Earth by Orbis Books, published in 2009. Eco-Theology, A Christian Conversation, which I just purchased in 2020 by Earthman Publishing, and Jenny Ratcliffe's book, Nothing Lowly in the Universe, An Integral Approach to the Ecological Crisis by the Crundell Press. Next. Other potential resources are third-party sustainable design accreditation resources, such as LEED, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, the WELL standard, which has to do with healthy buildings, the Living Building Challenge, which is, I think, the most inclusive resource, because it, as a baseline premise, it starts with net zero energy and tries to look at the building of a building in a way that promotes biophilia, and it actually incorporates habitat for other species. And of course, passive house standards. You've already had a presentation by Graham from Indwell. So they and other affordable housing developers could bring that part of the conversation to the development proposal. And another person that we're working with is Bob Walker at Longview Services. I know Epiphany in St. Mark's has just hired him to look at his charism is getting, knowing what grants are available to assist in affordable housing redevelopment projects for the churches. And he's now working with CMHC to try to streamline that process to ensure that more parishes can take advantage of affordable housing redevelopment projects. Next. So some final summary takeaways. Remember that before you start digging down the weeds and start arguing as to what mechanical systems or, you know, how many affordable housing units, understand that building is a worldview activity, and we need to shift our worldview from an egocentric to an earth-centric worldview in order to arrive at the right solutions and do the right thing. Sustainability is integral to the project and not just an accessory consideration. It's not something that's tagged on at the end. It has to be part of your mindset from the beginning. Do not proceed without a clear purpose cultivated through a fulsome visioning process. I strongly recommend that. And retain the services of experts. They are, in the end, they will be your best investment. I know that there's a lot of goodwill in parishes from volunteers, wardens, members of the congregation, many of whom have the best intentions but don't have the expertise to take these projects forward other than as representatives of the vision of the congregation. Next. That's it. Thank you very much. And now I welcome questions in whatever time we have left.
Thank you so much, Roberto. It was a delight, a treat to hear from you and to see these beautiful examples of different buildings that have accommodated sustainable design and also made that work with theological resonance as well. So I think we all have taken something good away from your talk tonight. I had a couple of questions that I noted in the chat, And the first one of them was from Monica, who we know from
Hi, Monica.
Hi, Monica from Bishop's Committee on Creation Care. And she asked, do government funds for energy efficiency apply to church buildings as well as other buildings? And you probably know that better than I do. It depends on the funds.
Yeah, it depends. Most of the incentives at the moment are being provided by Enbridge, who, so it's a bit counterintuitive perhaps because they're a fossil fuel provider. They do have monies available for the design consultants to maximize the energy efficiency of buildings. And certainly CMHC, when they're considering funding for affordable housing projects, if you're sustainable, that means that you get more points towards your maxing out your grant portion of their funding. It's really, really significant. You can end up with almost 50% of the cost of the building being provided by CMHC, most of which is a grant. So don't mistake it. The parishes do have to come up with funding, a contribution, and there have to be other partnerships. There's other government funding, which is associated with sustainability as well, which CMHC recognizes as a partner funding agency. And again, Bob Walker is much more conversant than I am in how nuanced all these different funding opportunities intersect. What else was I going to say? Sorry, Monica. Essentially, I think you have to go through the entire process, but sustainability, affordability, these are all criteria for getting funds. Also, the fact you remember my list, close to amenities, dealing with marginalized groups or difficult to house groups. Seniors are included in that. Which is why the project in Kitchener was looking at affordable senior housing for the Polish community, many of whom are widows or widowers. And, when they escaped Poland they were kind of economic refugees, they had to leave a lot of their resources at home. And so they haven't lived long enough to build up the kind of resources that most Canadians have an opportunity to do for their retirement.
Thank you. So this just relates to housing, not for church.
No, it can also relate to church. The Enbridge funding can relate to churches.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
And to a large degree, a lot of the other incentives on buildings specifically, if they're not offered by your energy provider like Enbridge, a lot of them are offered provincially too. So the current provincial government in Ontario is not really huge on offering those incentives, but the previous one was, and we are going to have another election next year. So keep that in mind when you consider.
Right, thanks.
That's my plug.
Yeah, but Monica, one more thing. Because the City of Toronto has adopted in council the strategy to achieve net zero by 2050, they have recognized that they have to be able to provide financial incentives.
Okay.
So they are going to work very closely with the provincial and federal governments and other funding sources to make sure that that is available. I think it's going to be most difficult, for example, many homeowners, they will not have the money. Like someone like myself will look at when my current furnace, which is fairly new, very high efficiency gas furnace with an EMC motor, it's kind of all variable speed. It's sort of top of the line, sustainable gas furnace and air conditioning. It's going to be good for another 15 or 20 years. When it dies and has to be replaced, I will look at a heat pump. And hopefully the technology will have improved by then and the cost will have come down. Right now, I would not recommend, well, I shouldn't say that. Mechanical engineers that I work with wouldn't recommend getting a heat pump at the moment to replace a gas furnace in a house, just because they're so expensive, so much more expensive. and they need supplemental heat anyway, like an electric duct heater coil, when the temperature drops below -10. Now, with global warming, that may not happen as often, but these are complex issues, is what I'm saying, Monica. There are no simple answers. And that's something that I'm working with a number of different volunteer organizations to kind of, constantly try to nuance and work on to find the best solution.
Thanks. That actually segues into our next question from Mike Clare, which is, how efficient and cost effective is geothermal today compared to, let's say, 15 years ago?
It's becoming much more cost effective, particularly if you consider what will inevitably be an increase in carbon tax over the years. So like I said, for the, put it this way, we were able to design and build a brand new church for the Hamilton Diocese of Milton on budget, using an more effective building envelope in terms of insulation and air tightness. We almost achieved passive house standards when we did our blower test. And the geothermal and the even the photovoltaics. So the next church in the diocese, which has not been, that's being built, which has not been designed to be sustainable, just to current code standards, is actually several $1 million more than the church we just completed. Mm-hmm. And I don't think inflation can be the only attributing factor. So I'm absolutely convinced that you can use these systems. And as I mentioned earlier, when we crunch the numbers, in today's dollars, not tomorrow or even 20 years from now, the parish would save $1.5 million over the next 50 years in operational and maintenance and equipment replacement costs over those 50 years by investing in geothermal now.
I have a question that relates to that, though. If you had to make an upfront capital purchase, so you choose, say, geothermal, but your budget is limited, which would you go for in terms of the, for example, the building behind me we put together for $14 million, house 32 seniors and some vulnerable youth. Our capital expenditures, we had a budget, and we could only, we couldn't go beyond the 14 million. Geothermal, if we put it in, or passive, or any of these things, the upfront cost would have sucked our budget. So how do you balance those two criteria of getting the thing built and what you're suggesting, which I think is brilliant?
Well, here's another example. And again, I don't know when it was that you were doing this. And clearly there are many, many factors when it comes to the economic equations that you have to consider. I agree. But for example, my mother, while she was still alive, lived in a retirement residence, which is for profit. And her entire 21-story building was heated and cooled with heat pumps that were driven by a geothermal system. So this is a for-profit developer realizing that he can, that investment was worthwhile. Somebody who's only really considering the bottom line, right, and return on investment, that all their facilities are heated and cooled with geothermal. So there must be a business model case to make, right? So again, maybe some of the other decisions you make, have to be weighed against the added cost, the initial capital investment, which admittedly is coming down. Mike, when was your project completed?
We opened it up in September of last year.
Oh, okay. So, but when did you start the design process? How many years ago? 2016. Oh, well, that's interesting. So, I mean, the residence that my mother had lived in was built, let's see, she was 90 when she moved in. So in 2012. So even back then, it was, the business case was still worthwhile for a for-profit developer.
I think the other aspect of it too is you've got, as you were suggesting, it's the contractors. And if you have a contractor who's willing to do this, and initially we didn't.
Yeah, you see, you need an entire team, from the design team to the funders to the contractors, who are all familiar with these strategies, because it takes everybody's commitment to be able to realize these types of projects. St. Gabriels was the first LEED Gold building in Toronto and the first LEED Gold church in Canada. We had to educate the entire construction crew on how to achieve that metric. So it was an ongoing thing, but we achieved it. It wasn't onerous. It just meant that they had to change the way they did things for the last few decades, even when it came to waste management and recycling and that sort of thing of building materials, right? So, Mike, I don't know if your operational budget can support buying bullfrog power, but I mean, that would be one way to offset your carbon footprint, right?
I actually haven't looked at the cost of bullfrog compared to Electra, but that's a good suggestion, and I think I'll follow through on that.
Yeah.
The other thing is, we did a building in 2005 for 120 people, and it was beyond LEED. But the problem is with the geothermal at the time, and that initiated my question.
Right.
The geothermal has been a bit of a problem just in the maintenance, and because it was so new at the time.
Yeah, it has everything to do with the soil conditions, the ability of the soil to transfer that delta in temperature, right? As you know, the Earth's temperature below 6 feet is at more or less a constant temperature. So you kind of extract the temperature differential between the Earth and the air at the time to either extract cooling or heating. And it also has to be sized correctly. And so far, the systems in both Guelph and in Milton are working beautifully, just as designed. And so, but again, it's part of a bigger picture too. The whole building envelope, the way and the installation, who installs it, whether you have competent trades, all those kinds of things, and good design.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm looking around for any other folks with questions. Oh, David Cook. Go ahead, David.
Thanks for this, Roberto. I'm crashing the party from Guelph, so I'm just a few steps away from Our Lady, which is a beautiful site. I'm a former builder, and I'm really fascinated with this whole question of embodied energy. But if I look at our stock of old churches, it's a real challenge, isn't it? In terms of retrofitting them. Do you have any more to say about, like, what sort of portion of these old structures could be retrofit? I mean, you think about the R values you just stated for the new church. We're so far away from those.
Right. Okay, so let me give you an example, because you're in Guelph. We just finished the retrofitting and restoration, conservation, and renovation, in addition to the rectory building, which is to the southeast of the church. Again, it had its heritage value, so we had to retain the building. We tore down a more modern addition from the 1930s and replaced it with, there we could use a highly efficient building envelope. And we use radiant floor heating in the old building. We also actually, and again, this is part of building science, right? So based on kind of evidence that the heritage industry has developed, we did add an interstitial layer to the inside of the rubble stone. like a Slicker Max. I don't know if you're familiar with that product, as a bit of a gap to allow for air circulation and drying out if any water did get through the wall. Then we had 2x4 studs set 1 inch back from that with spray foam insulation to R13. And then that left us enough room within the stud depth to run our conduit or our wiring and any piping or whatever, and then the drywall. So what that did was just provide that sweet spot of thermal insulation to allow enough heat to get through to dry out the stone, the masonry, solid masonry walls, so you don't accelerate the exterior deterioration of those walls. They were also protected with a lime render and Kime products, which disbursement paints and renders, so that we improve the thermal efficiency of the building without sacrificing its heritage character, without accelerating its deterioration. And we use 2 very, very high efficient condensing boilers to heat both buildings. And thank you for reminding me. I want to get in touch with now that it's been up and running for like all 4 seasons, I want to find out what their utility bills are to see how much where.
So I'm assuming that improved the envelope as well quite a bit in terms of the ACH.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and in that case, for cooling, we used split systems, Mitsubishi systems, as opposed to having lots of ductwork, and we used an ERV.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry to the others for all this technical stuff, but that's a language that David and I speak.
I got another question in the chat, which I think is actually more for Rob Safri than it is for Roberto.
Okay.
But since Rob Safri's here, the question is, has or will the diocese, or is the diocese considering creating a department or staff support where churches can look to help to navigate redevelopment? And over to you, Rob.
I think it's absolutely something we're considering. As we look to the future, I think, and develop a strategic plan for the future, that certainly this is a high priority, but it's one of a number of things. So I think we're just going to have to wait until the next strategic plan is placed. But certainly, we recognize that it's a place that we need to go.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Well, I guess it's getting to that time. So speaking of which, I'm going to turn it back to Rob. And thanks so much again, Roberto, for your engagement with all these questions. And if anybody thinks of anything else that they want to ask, either of Roberto or anyone else, do send it to my email, which is on your screen there, egolden, GOULDEN, @toronto.anglican.ca, and I will refer it to the person who should answer that question. Thank you.
Again, Roberto, that was fantastic. So much to think about tonight. Thank you for that.
Very welcome.
What's next for us with our series? We just completes our summer series, and we have our next session scheduled on September 11th. In terms of the previous question, in terms of what the diocese is going to offer, this is more what we are currently doing. As you know, so much of what we do in the diocese is focused on our parishes, and needs to, I think one of Roberto's points is that we need to have a vision, and each parish for every project needs to have a vision. And that's part of what this series is about trying to have each of you here tonight sort of consider what your future is and to start to think about developing that vision, because everything comes from that. And so the next session really is going to be focused on the Diocese of Toronto. So for people, you know, in areas outside of the Diocese of Toronto, it's probably not going to be terribly interesting to you, because it's going to be more about our internal processes and how, you know, what kind of steps from a governance perspective you're going to need to go through to look at a development, and what kind of financial resources the diocese is going to be able to provide to help you along that route. And I say the longer term question, and honestly, we're not there yet, but is what kind of you know, resources, more significant, is the diocese possibly going to be able to provide in the future to help parishes? Because we know that a lot of our parishes are at a point where they the buildings are tired, and we need to look at how we can use them responsibly to meet the needs of our congregations, but more than that, also the needs of the communities that our congregations are in. So thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to seeing those of you from the Diocese of Toronto on September 11th.